I am Beth Pruitt. I'm SA's Manager of Education and Outreach and Staff Archaeologist. So this year we would have met in San Francisco, California, but instead we'll be meeting online. And the advantage of that is that we can really open up our public programming to everyone, not just those who happen to be in the same city that we are. Archaeology isn't just about the past, it's also about the present and connecting to the communities where we work and learn. Wherever you are joining us from today, I'd like to gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their homes there today. I'd like to keep that in mind as we talk about these lands and histories. Thank you, and thank you to all of our speakers today. I mean, I put the program together, but I'm still amazed at just the range of topics and perspectives that we have, all connecting to, archaeologists, curators, heritage caretakers, all of those connections, but still such a wide range of work that you all do. So thank you so much. So we would love to hear all of your questions, all of you listening. And I can start us off with one for Dr. Delgado, if that's all right. Did you want to answer this one about
the one
from the history teacher? That may have already been answered.
I said I would answer it live.
Okay.
The question is, and actually I love getting this question from this teacher because he's teaching at my alma mater high school.
Oh, wow.
In San Jose. So good to see that. Greg, please say hello to Richard Taylor in the math department. We were in the same class, the first class at the high school. The question was, what would that wine taste like? It tastes awful. When the Niantic was excavated, we recovered a couple cases of champagne. It was no longer champagne, it was brackish, it was flat, and by brackish I mean really salty, with a certain amount of mud in it and some strange things growing in it. But we had so much of it, as we had it analyzed, and we could tell it had been a very nice, varietal, possibly French. We ultimately were able to recover enough of a label to find that it was a specific champagne from a vineyard known as Jacques Fille, and we were able to make contact with that vineyard, which still exists, which is the moral of the story. We did sample the wine in the lab, and it was awful, absolutely awful. But when we wrote Jacques Fille, they sent us a case. And I can assure you, the more recent stuff tasted great. All of the other alcohol that we've seen through there in the years with the excavations, and there's sites I didn't talk about, included one site where we had an entire crate of whiskey. And back in the lab, yes, after we'd capped and sealed a number of bottles and we took some samples out, we did, with the syringe, squirt a little bit into a snifter, and it actually tasted really good. Now, in this case, it hadn't caught fire. It was sealed in the mud, and in those kinds of conditions, it was on ice, literally, for over a century and a half. Now, that may not be proper archaeological practice in a way, but I found, as an archaeologist who likes to connect to the public and communicate science, and thank you, Anna, for that great presentation on this, I found that it really helps give people a sense that we archaeologists, while we're scientists, are also people. We're capable of mistakes, we're capable of doing a variety of things, but we're also interested in experience. And in this case, that bit of experience of the past was pretty powerful and pretty cool. While I've got this, I just want to say, Joe, your presentation meant a great deal. I was the first park historian for the National Park Service at Alcatraz. And at any and every time we were there, we were very much aware of that aspect of the history. And I'm sure, as you would be aware, back in those days in the 70s, so soon after the event, we cultural resources folks had a heck of a time fighting certain battles. One of the battles we won as a compromise was not only was everything left behind and written on the walls documented, but we insisted that they not paint it over with paint that would permanently mar it. And when that paint finally wore off and it said Indian land again at the dock, a number of us felt yes, because that was an important part of that island's history. And so that logbook is amazing. And I think you have powerfully shared an artifact that speaks to a very profound truth that many people in this country need to understand and appreciate. So thank you very, very much for that.
Thank you for your kind words. Thank you.
And next I'd like to direct a question to Leah Grant. The question asker says, how are the technicians chosen for your lab?
So the technicians are chosen like any other employee. They're coming, it's a temporary paid position. So they fill out an application online and we schedule interviews and they get hired based on just certain criteria. And typically we have like post 9/11 veterans is who we serve the most, but it can really vary. But yeah, it's a job, so they fill out an application. Yeah.
That makes sense. And then I have a question for Greg Castro that came through privately. The question asker asks, how extensive was the Ramaytush-Ohlone trade network in the pre-Columbian era, and did it extend to the cultures of the Southwest and or Mesoamerican?
Specific to the Ramaytush, there is actually very little left. They were so heavily impacted, as Dr. Delgado talked about, the Spanish period of the missions, the Mexican period, and then followed quickly by the United States period with Gold Rush. Actually, most of the Ramaytush people kind of disappeared for survival reasons, with a few survivors by the 1850s and 60s. So we don't have much specific to the Ramaytush. But in general, for Ohlone and Salinan people, though, it's known that they've had extensive trade networks, and they're always finding more. And I think over the time that I've been involved in archaeology, since the early 90s, they've expanded their understanding, and despite, I think, their preconceived notions, in a sense, that they've found evidence of trade materials going all the way almost to the Mississippi in a few cases, but certainly into the Midwest. Trade was very common throughout California. Things are easy to identify, like obsidian being traded all over California, from the Sierras in Northern California down to other places where the obsidian didn't normally occur and is treated as a precious material. So we know within California it was quite extensive and ongoing, but it did extend further out, and as far as I understand is Utah, perhaps Wyoming, materials from California have been data verified that the trade network was at least that extensive, if not further.
Thank you. The next question is for Joe Horse Capture. How come the Indians of all tribes took Alcatraz Island when it previously had a right with inmates? What was the significance of holding that island?
One of the interpretation, they interpreted the Fort Laramie Treaty saying that surplus government land, that is land is no longer being used, could go back to Native Americans. And because Alcatraz, the prison in the island, had been abandoned and not used as a prison anymore, they considered that surplus land. And plus, you know, it was high visibility, it was right in the bay. It's like the perfect place for them to occupy. And as I mentioned, it had profound impact. So that was the reason. It was a surplus. It was an interpretation of the Fort Laramie Treaty that's saying surplus land, government land, can go back to Native Americans. So they took it over.
Thank you. And then a question for Anna Goldfield. What is the latest research about Neanderthals being done that really excites you?
Oh, how many hours do you have? Um, so there are a few things that, a few categories of Neanderthal research that are currently really exciting. One is in genomics and DNA, and kind of further teasing apart what we know about the Neanderthal genome and how Neanderthal populations interacted with Homo sapiens, because we know that there was interbreeding between those populations. And there was just a paper published today, I think, in Nature that shows that, full disclosure, I haven't read the paper, but I've read at least 6 blurbs about it. But it shows that Neanderthals may have interbred with populations of Homo sapiens more recently than previously thought. Not wildly more recently, not within the past years of Homo sapiens, but the other is Neanderthal technology. And so there is a lot of new research happening on types of materials that Neanderthals worked with that are sort of surprising in that it was previously thought that only Homo sapiens made, for example, bone tools, and a wide variety of tools from bone or wood and things like that. And fairly recently, some artifacts have been found, including Neanderthal-made bone tools and even some wooden artifacts that are attributed to Neanderthals, and even evidence for things like string. That's still debated, but there is some evidence that Neanderthals worked with fibers, which is really exciting. And because all of this kind of has, it has a meaning for what we think about Neanderthal cognition and their ability to plan and to create multi-step, multi-part technologies. And so anything that really speaks to Neanderthal ability to the Neanderthal likeness to Homo sapiens that really kind of fills in that picture of how Neanderthals lived and interacted with their resources and their environment is really fascinating to me. And then the final thing, before I go on and on and on, but the final thing I will say is that there was research that recently came out that compared CT scans of Neanderthal and anatomically modern human outer and middle ears. And while there are no preserved soft tissues from Neanderthals, so it's very, very difficult to determine, for example, what their throat and tongue would have been like. But in terms of their bones and that anatomy, and including this new study about the ears, they would have had all of the anatomical components that would have allowed them to have speech very much like the types of sounds that humans can produce. And with the ear study, it shows that they could also hear the same, an overlapping band of frequencies to Homo sapiens. So they would have been able to produce and to hear similar sounds to Homo sapiens. And I think that's fascinating and so frustrating because there's so much more to know that we just can't get at without some sort of, find in a glacier, as if that's going to happen. But it's just there's the potential for learning more as new technologies develop is maybe the thing that excites me the most, is that technologies and analyses keep getting more and more refined, and we can fill in that picture more and more and learn more and more about these ancient populations, and now Denisovans and everybody else. It's all just very exciting. I'm very excited about all of it.
Thank you. Yeah, it doesn't get much more latest than published today. So thank you. And then a question came through for Leah that I think you answered in the chat, but maybe for everyone else. What percentage of veterans go on to get a job or follow up on a degree in archaeology?
Sure. Well, it's actually pretty small, and I don't have an exact number for you, but the program wasn't designed to train archaeologists, but it seems that we have a lot of people in our lab and some of the other labs too that are just very interested in history and archaeology. I think we've had in our sessions, we've had one each session interested in museum studies or archaeology. We just recently had a technician hired with NPS working at the John Muir House and various other, he works at like 4 museums now as a museum technician for them. So the skills that they get here are definitely transferable to the industry, but they weren't necessarily intended to do so. So it's becoming more and more where there's an interest here and jobs are hard to get. I think when we have a veteran who happens to have an interest or some education in anthropology or history, they seek us out now. Yeah.
And to follow up with that, there was another question that asked, how do veterans learn about your program?
If you just search Veterans Curation Program, I think my project manager stuck a link in the chat box too. We also have social media. We have Facebook, we have Instagram and LinkedIn too. So all the information about the program and some of our training materials are on the website. And there's also an online application we're currently hiring now for the session that's going to start in May in all of our labs, the flagship labs in Augusta, San Mateo, Alexandria, and St. Louis.
So I see the link in the chat, but I think it just went to the panelists. So I'm going to share that so that all the attendees will be able to click on that.
Great, thank you.
And then I actually had a question for Mr. Horscapture. You specifically used the word reclaimed, not decolonized. Could you expand on that? What the difference between the terms would be? I don't know if that's going to be the next half an hour. I would be okay with that.
Well, I didn't use the term reclaim. The proclamation used the term reclaim.
Right.
I am, and my colleagues here at the Autry, and anybody who listens to me probably get tired of me saying this, but since you have a new audience who haven't been tired of me saying it, I'll do it again. I am not a fan of the term decolonization within a museum context. You can't decolonize an institution that is based on colonization, right? You just can't do it. The term that I prefer is reclaim. As Native people, we can reclaim our land, our narrative, our stories, our ancestors, our language, our intellectual property, our arts, everything. For me, I mean, I like the idea of decolonization, of course, and I support that. However, this is not a new thing, right? 1969, Alcatraz. 1972, the exhibition, American Indian Art Form and Tradition. All these different things in history of Native people reclaiming their narrative within the museum. So-called decolonization is not new. It is actually very, very old. Now everybody just picks it up as a buzzword. I come from the perspective that what we're trying to do, from my perspective, is we're not trying to change the entire museum field. What we're trying to do is get museums to do what they said they're supposed to do. That is, present cultures from the world in an equal way. And that hasn't been done. So we are reclaiming that narrative. We're not so-called decolonization. You know, I can decolonize my refrigerator, my freezer, which means I'm taking the ice out, but you can't decolonize a museum because the museum's foundation is colonization. So it just, I can't throw some mushrooms on the steak and say, oh, look, it's vegetarian. It doesn't work that way. The end.
Thank you. Yes, that explained it very well. Thank you. Next, a question came through for Dr. Delgado. Where are the excavated boats now? Reburied or moved?
The bow of Niantic sits under Redwood Park next to the Transamerica Pyramid. General Harrison still sits beneath what's now the Club Quarters Hotel and the Starbucks at the corner of Battery and Sansom. Apollo still sits sort of in pieces underneath the old Federal Reserve Bank. And there are probably a few dozen other shipwrecks that are still around. If you go online, and I should have brought the link, the National Park Service at San Francisco Maritime did a map of all of the buried ships that we think are still in and around downtown San Francisco. So there's a fair amount that's there, but there's also other things that are down there. Then the archaeology of downtown San Francisco through the years has encountered a number of very profound things. We've seen a fair deal of evidence, particularly of this colonial era, starting with the Spanish and Mexican occupation, not only at the Presidio, but moving out into the beginning, the ethnogenesis of the Hispanic California community, as Barb Voss has shown us, but also particularly there in Yerba Buena Cove at the site of the original Yerba Buena. What's also powerful is that we're now seeing strong archaeological evidence of that which Greg Castro and everybody else knows is there, which is the earlier and the very long-standing occupation, settlement, and knowledge of those lands. While the oldest quote-unquote site dates back to some 9,000 years ago, I think the latest thing that we're understanding, at least those who listen, is that what Greg said is true. Absolutely. I mean, people have been there for a very long time. And what most people don't appreciate or understand is that the landscape has changed not only through the industrial process in the modern era, but climate change, particularly at the end of the last great ice age, flooded much of coastal California. And there's no way people were not there. Stories passed on by elders speak to this. And so older ancestral sites are out there. I mean, the Farallon Islands, 26 miles off the coast, were the coast originally, and coastal mountains where the original mouth of the Sacramento River was when it came through a narrow little canyon and then moved on the coast. And that canyon today, by the way, is the Golden Gate. So there's so much that is seemingly lost unless, of course, like Greg and his folks, as well as many others, that is there. And that, for me, is the exciting part of this. It is the fact that archaeology can do so much, but the most important thing you can do is listen and to hear other voices and what things mean to them and what they know as well to be true. And with that, I mean, particularly in a town like San Francisco, which is so diverse and has been since the beginning, what I see increasingly, and I've seen it over the past 40 odd years, has been more voices are being heard, more voices are sharing their stories, and perspectives are evolving away from the old thinking. And I think that's absolutely critical. And in that, I was really excited to hear about the Neanderthal, because my sense has always been people are people. Just because you lived in the past didn't make you primitive or stupid. As we know from indigenous cultures, these are profoundly intelligent, spiritual people who have developed technologies of their own that are revolutionary in their time. We all build upon that experience, and occasionally natural and cultural forces may tear down or suppress some of that, but it does come through in the end. And in that, I mean, I'm always reminded of the story attributed to Mark Twain. And I'd like to think that maybe this speaks to archaeology. When we were younger as a discipline, we would look at the rest of the world and we would look at the understanding of the past and think how little of it was known, or how primitive it was, or how primitive or perhaps not as savvy people were in those days. Give it a little time and you appreciate and you understand that that's wrong. Because as Twain said, when he was 17, he thought his father was a very ignorant man. But when Twain came home a few years later at 21, he was surprised at how much the old boy had learned. So I think that with this, we are seeing the power of archaeology done right, which is listening and working with people.
Thank you. Yeah, and if any of the other speakers, if at any time you also have a comment that you'd like to jump in, please feel free to. I have some questions for Leah. What is your educational and professional background? Are you a veteran? And maybe you could just speak a little bit sort of generally about how you got involved in this work.
Okay, sure. Yeah, well, I am. I'm an Army veteran. I've been out of the military for more than half my life now. And I went to trade school for a totally different career and started getting bored and began taking college classes in history and took a cultural anthropology class, thought that was pretty neat. And then I took a archaeology class taught by a maritime archaeologist. And I was just, I don't know, that was it. Like the historical archaeology and the maritime stuff was just really fascinating to me. So the next thing I know, I was getting a BA and I doubled in history and anthropology. And currently I'm finishing up my master's in applied anthropology now. And getting into this job was really kind of a fluke. Someone sent me the job posting a few hours before it was due, before it was called. And I sent in my application and it ended up being a really great match. I get to use my professional degrees and work with collections and really cool archaeological collections. But I also get to help and work with the veteran community and all other parts of the archaeological community, which is just, I don't know, a great group of people. So yeah, I think I answered that.
I think so too. And that also actually makes me want to open that up to the other speakers. If any of you would be willing to jump in with your journey into the work that you do now.
Sure, I guess I can. So obviously, as I mentioned before, I'm a second generation Native curator, Native American curator. I am not a veteran. My brother is, and my father was, and my grandfather was, but I was not, I am not. I got a internship at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, went back to Montana, went to school, came back, ended up being associate curator of Native American art at the Minneapolis Institute of Art for 15 years, grew the collection there by 43%, raised a lot of money, did some great catalogs and some great partnerships. I actually did an exhibition about my tribe there for 15 years. Then I went to National Museum of the American Indian, where I was a associate curator there of research and collections, was there for a few years, which was great. Then I went to the Minnesota Historical Society, where I was director of Native American initiatives. I started that department, worked there for a few years, and I've been at the Autry since last March. Well, I went to Europe, did some research there for a research program there, which was great for a couple months. Started the Autry about a year ago, at the beginning of March. Literally worked 4 days in the office, and the whole city shut down. So I've been employed by the Autry, but I've only been actually at work for 4 days. I've been working from home ever since.
You could have fooled me with that Zoom background. Anyone else can jump in if you'd like.
Sure. It was out of necessity. It was no plan to it. In the very early 90s, the Salinan community decided to formalize their structure with the tribal council, which was happening a lot during the late 80s, early 90s, all across California. And these are people that had goals in mind, but no idea how to do them. And one of the things that they were striving for was federal recognition at the time. That was sort of the thing that drove a lot of the work. But what happened for a lot of communities, and certainly true for ours, is that as soon as we poked our head out of the ground, all these agencies started calling us because they wanted to consult. The heart of our homeland, of my dad's homeland, the Salinan people, is a military base, 400 Leggett. You've probably seen it in a couple of movies. It's in Monterey County and just south of the Big Sur. The Salinan territory encompasses places like Hearst Castle, for those of you far away that would probably recognize that. And it's very rural. A lot of it is relatively untouched. A lot of it's public land. And a lot of it's private land that has not been used except for cattle grazing for a long time. So there's a lot of our cultures that's still actually intact, but hidden. The military base was going through one of the first efforts to categorize their cultural resources. And it turned out to be a huge project because there was literally thousands of cultural resources of our people still on the base, even with all the military practice going on and the damage caused from it. But yet it was also quite rich in our culture. And they wanted consultants, site monitors, and that sort of thing to be involved. And once we started working with them, all the other agencies like Caltrans, the Transportation Department, state parks, National Forest Service, they all jumped in, and there we were trying to do archaeology, and none of us are archaeologists. We were fortunate that someone who's still a good friend of mine was working at 400 Leggett and kind of stewarded us and helped us in that work. And I became eventually, through her, Janet Eisnes, who now works for a tribe up in Northern California. Because of her, I became involved in archaeology and in the Society for California Archaeology. And one of the things that we were doing right away is addressing that issue of tribes not having that knowledge, kind of going into it blind, deaf and dumb, into this world that, you know, to be honest, does not have a good history with Native people, certainly in California. And so a lot of trepidation had to be overcome by Native people. My elders would sometimes still ask us, why are you still playing with those archaeologists? But they're dealing with our culture, and the laws allow that to happen. And so we have to be there. That's our caretaker role given to us. And so I became involved and stayed involved. One of the things that I was involved in right away with the SCA was we put on workshops to try to train communities, Native communities throughout California, on the laws and the practicalities of archaeology. Maybe how to do site surveys, just whatever they needed for their particular area. So, like some areas needed help, analyzing timber harvest plans. Other areas wouldn't have that. They would have some other archaeological work to be done focused on that. So we tried to tailor assistance, and a lot of it was done through the auspices of the Society for California Archaeology. A lot of it was for free, pro bono work, which I really appreciate. So it was an effort by archaeologists to address the history of archaeology with Native people in a good way. So I'm appreciative of that. And that was done through the Native American Programs Committee, and I wound up being chair a few years ago, and continuing in that role, trying to get Native people to come to the table, so to speak, wherever that table is in dealing with their culture.
Thank you. Anyone else like to share their background?
I'll do this quickly, amazingly enough. I started by becoming radicalized in 1972 when I was growing up in San Jose, and construction workers bulldozed a 3,000-year-old indigenous site belonging to the Ohlone people and laughed about it. And I was outraged. At that stage, I was more interested in Egypt than the rest, but this opened my eyes to what was literally in my own area. I went out and saved as much as I could, was able to get in touch with Phil Galvin of the Ohlone, and returned as many of those remains that I could get back from the workers, and they were reburied. So long before NAGPRA, just fired up by that. For that reason, I decided not to go into prehistoric archaeology, as it was called, but rather historical and colonial. And it was Niantic that turned me into a maritime archaeologist. My BA is from San Francisco State. My MA in maritime archaeology, my PhD is in good old-fashioned archaeology from Simon Fraser in Canada. But my dissertation was, of course, buried ships. I've worked in a variety of jobs, many in the National Park Service, in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, where I was director of maritime heritage. In museums, I was a museum director, a maritime museum, where we powerfully were able to work with the Inuit people of the North, because one of the themes we worked on was the Arctic. Did maritime archaeology up there too. Ran a nonprofit institute working on shipwrecks globally. And then most recently, after I retired from NOAA, I'm now the senior vice president with Search, and we're a cultural resources company based out of Florida. I deal mostly with our deep water archaeology, and these days that's been, deep water shipwrecks, most of them focusing on more modern times. The last big project I did off of California was the aircraft carrier Independence off San Francisco, which was scuttled in 1951 after its use in the atomic tests at Bikini. So I do a lot of the work now, with robots and looking miles deep. But I will always return home to California, whether literally or virtually as today.
I'm happy to go. I felt sort of a junior panelist, so I thought I should let everybody go first. I got my PhD in archaeology in 2017, and after doing all that, I sort of realized at that point that despite what I saw as the path put before me as a PhD student of either become a researcher or become a professor, I realized that I didn't want to do either of those things. And kind of as a stroke of luck, in 2017, I started writing for sapiens.org, which is a wonderful online anthropology journal, magazine, whatever you want to call it, for the public. And in working with Sapiens and the team of editors there, and realizing that I really, really enjoyed translating studies from archaeology and anthropology, but more broadly, the sciences, translating that to get people as excited about these things and the natural world, the world around us, and our shared human past, getting people as excited about those things as I was, and being able to write in a way that accomplished that. And the next year, one of my closest friends from undergrad and I started the Dirt podcast, mostly because we were both in the same position of just sort of looking for jobs and not sure what we wanted to do career-wise. And that has progressed into something that we both, it's a side project. We both have day jobs, but we love making the show. It lets us research a new topic each week. And the dialogue that we have with listeners and the amount of positive feedback that we get, and an incredibly gratifying number of downloads and streams and listens that we get, has been really affirming in that not only is science communication a viable career option, but it's an important one. And so it took I sort of backed my way into it, but I realized that rather than strictly an academic profession, what I wanted most was something academic adjacent that allowed me to explore lots and lots of different things, because I don't have a great attention span and I'm interested in so many things, and to be able to explore those things and to share them with people is really sort of what I want to do with my career. And so that's more or less where I am now, is working towards building that as a full-time job that actually pays the bills.
Thank you. Yes, and both the Dirt podcast and sapiens.org are great resources for archaeological information.
Thank you.
And Jim, you had mentioned NAGPRA, and I just want to expand that out for those in the audience who may not know, but NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It was passed in the United States in 1990, and had an impact on how archaeologists consult with Native Americans relating to graves and sacred items. There's a question here for Leah. You may have to help me with government acronyms, but it asks about what MOS?
Sure. I was a 91 Bravo, which is a medic, medical specialist. So that those numbers mean something else nowadays. It's changed, as has the whole training. But yeah, I was a medic.
Thank you. And we've got about 5 minutes left. And so what I'd like to do is maybe ask you, for those in the audience who aren't archaeologists, have no intention to become archaeologists, or people whose job focuses on the past, why should they care about history or archaeology?
Because it connects you to where you are, because it reminds you that you don't know everything. Whether you're an archaeologist or not, there's always room to explore and to learn. Carefully, respectfully, but to do that. And I think it's also part of feeling part of something that many people don't necessarily get, perhaps. I mean, I know from my indigenous friends, they have this tradition that goes back thousands of years. I see this when I talk with my friends in Australia who are indigenous, and I certainly saw that with Inuit elders with whom I worked. But many of the rest of us don't, particularly in this more modern post-colonial world in which we live. And I think that's why so many people came to watch what we were doing in San Francisco when we dug up the General Harrison. As we did that, 9/11 happened, and we closed the site for 2 days. And when we came back, there were thousands of people gathered to watch us. And what came out ultimately, and Deb Sorkin wrote about it, was people looked at what was down in that hole and they realized San Francisco had been destroyed once and had come back again. And perhaps in that we do see something more about the indomitable nature of the human spirit, something that has been tested in this last year. We've been through bad times, we've been through good times, but we have been here. And it's important to listen not only to the voices of archaeologists, but to the voices of people who connect to those other cultures and those other times.
It would be challenging for me to provide a counter narrative to that, because to me it's right on. The only thing that I would add is not only do you learn about the world around you, but also it's an opportunity to learn about yourself. But good words.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. Since I've been in my job here at the VCP, I'm amazed at how many connections we make and how many different communities connect over a box of groundstone or, a box of rusty nails. Like there's just so much connection and learning and engaging different people who just have different passions and interests and different ways of understanding things. It's such a real positive experience to be able to, connect over something that you just wouldn't think has that power, like an inanimate object that echoes all these stories. Yeah.
And I would add that you can push that very, very far into the past, that connection, whether it's seeing a human fingerprint on a ceramic from thousands of years ago, or, being able to understand that, Neanderthals faced many of the same social and survival problems that modern humans faced, and just being able to understand that the past wasn't a series of sort of static vignettes or sites, that it was a dynamic place populated by people. And so connecting to that dynamic past and to those populations of real people living real lives, archaeology has the power to give voices back to those that have been lost, to allow people to see these intimate moments of lives lived thousands of years ago, that I think really provides this commonality and connection to fellow humans. That's my favorite part of archaeology.
Greg, do you have any comments you'd like to send us off with?
I think that everybody said it so well, but I think one thing I would add in my work I've done is the consequences of not knowing what happened before you. I think I've seen that in our native communities, obviously, that it impacted us directly. But I think now with the last few years, we're seeing what's happened in society in general. And I'm not just talking about the social unrest, that obviously not knowing history, it had a huge bearing on that, not fully understanding the complete breadth of it and all the viewpoints expressed in it. But other parts of it, like the wildfires here in California, not understanding how our ancestors were so in tune and integrated with the land and helped manage it in such a subtle way that archaeology, biology, sciences didn't recognize it until relatively recently, that was how active we were in that work, and how the things that we're seeing now in terms of wildfires and the wildlife management is kind of gone off the cliff because the active work of our ancestors for thousands of years was abruptly stopped. And that was a relatively recent history, and it didn't take long for nature to show the ill part of that decision to ban our cultural, our culture from being practiced for after thousands of years in just a very short time, the consequences of that. So I think there's the other part of it too, of what happens when you don't understand what came before you, because everything you stand on, you build on, you do now is built on top of things that happened before.
Thank you. And thank you all of the speakers so much for sharing that human connection with us today. And thank you to all of the attendees. There are more talks and resources available for Online Archaeology Week at saa.org/public week. Thank you all so much, and take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.